Welcome to the Graduated Thoughts Podcast.
Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We are so glad you're here with us today because we have I think it's a staggering, almost incomprehensible paradox to explore.
It really is.
And it's one that directly impacts the world you walk through every single day. I want you to just take a moment and look around at the modern global landscape.
Right.
We are living in an era of absolutely unprecedented, just mind-boggling global wealth. We are talking about trillions of dollars flowing through digital markets in fractions of a millisecond.
Yeah.
We have sprawling, futuristic metropolises, breathtaking technological advancements, and this massive surplus of resources, food, and capital that would have seemed like outright magic to our ancestors just a few centuries ago.
Literally magic.
Yes, and here's the paradox. Alongside all of this incredible abundance, massive segments of the global black population remain structurally and persistently impoverished, stretching from the continent of Africa to black communities right here in America and across the entire diaspora. It is a glaring, defining divide of our time. So the question we are tackling today is just, how did this happen?
Yeah, that is the question.
Are some nations or groups of people just perpetually unlucky? Did they somehow miss the boat on global progress while everyone else was sailing ahead?
It is arguably the defining question of our modern economic era. And the short answer to that question is no.
No.
It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a missed boat. To really answer it, we have to look far past the symptoms we see on the evening news and examine the actual historical foundation.
Right.
We have to look at how the modern world, the very economic air we breathe today, was actually built from the ground up.
And to do that properly, we have brought an absolute mountain of sources to the table today. If you can see the studio right now, the desk is practically bowing under the weight of this literature.
Just a heavy stack.
It is. This is some of the most rigorous, paradigm-shifting, and frankly challenging text out there. We're going to be pulling heavily from Claude Anderson's Black Labor, White Wealth, Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, Walter Rodney's legendary and foundational How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Dambisa Moyo's highly debated modern critique, Debt Aid.
That one is definitely going to spark some thought.
Oh, absolutely. And we also have Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Examoglu and Robinson's massive economic study, Why Nations Fail, and the foundational historical texts by the great John Henrik Clarke.
It's quite the syllabus for today.
It is. Our mission today is to unpack the invisible architecture of the modern world. We want to understand how extraction, dependency, and wealth transfer systematically shaped both the massive compounding prosperity of the West and the corresponding underdevelopment of Africa and the African diaspora. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is a daunting stack of reading, I'll admit, but the thread connecting all of it is profound and undeniable. If we want to understand today's headlines, whether you're reading about inner-city poverty, the racial wealth gap, or the sovereign debt struggles of developing nations, we have to realize that development and underdevelopment are not separate, isolated events happening in vacuums.
Right, they aren't parallel tracks.
Exactly. They are two sides of the exact same historical coin. You literally cannot have one without the other in the global economic system we currently inhabit.
Let's start right there with that specific word. Underdevelopment. Because usually when you or I hear that a nation or a community is underdeveloped or a developing nation, it sounds like a natural state of being.
Yes, it sounds passive.
Like they're just lagging behind in a global marathon, maybe because they started late or they don't have the right shoes or they're just not running fast enough.
Right.
But Walter Rodney completely flips that narrative on its head in his work, doesn't he?
Oh.
It's a total grammar shift.
It is a brilliant and necessary conceptual shift. Rodney's groundbreaking thesis in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is that underdevelopment is not a natural state of being, nor is it simply the absence of development.
Okay.
Underdevelopment, in Rodney's framework, is an active process.
An active process.
Yes. It is a verb. A nation or a people doesn't just happen to be underdeveloped. They're actively underdeveloped by outside forces through systematic, calculated wealth extraction.
Wow.
To use your marathon analogy, you aren't lagging behind because you're slow. You're lagging behind because someone has actively tied iron weights to your ankles, and they are using the metal from your chains to build the vehicle they are driving to the finish line.
That is such a crucial distinction for us to hold on to as we go forward today. Underdevelopment is a verb. It's an action taken against a group.
Exactly.
And to anchor this historically, to see when those weights were first forged, we have to look at the timeline provided by John Henrik Clarke. And this didn't start yesterday.
Not at all.
Clarke asserts that the seeds of this entire global European-American system of wealth and extraction were planted in a very specific, pivotal window of history between 1482 and 1536.
A critical 50-year span.
Right. When Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he didn't just discover a new world. According to Clarke, he essentially set into motion a 300-year process that completely violently rewired the global economy.
Rewired entirely.
Clarke points out that Africa was forcibly transitioned from a continent of independent societies into what he calls the Black Mother.
The Black Mother.
Yeah, a continent tasked with producing living, breathing commodities to fuel a rapidly expanding global capitalist system.
And that transformation, that shift to the Black Mother, required tearing down existing, highly complex societies. It's a very common misconception that European colonizers arrived in a primitive land.
Oh, definitely.
Before this 1482 to 1536 window, sub-Saharan Africa was politically, culturally, agriculturally, and artistically comparable to Europe.
Right, there were massive empires, trade routes, universities like in Timbuktu.
Exactly. But to feed the engine of this new global trade system, African development was deliberately paralyzed.
Deliberately.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can bring in Siluglu and Robinson's framework from Why Nations Fail. They provide an excellent, modern economic language for exactly what Clarke and Rodney are describing historically.
I love their framework.
It's so useful. They divide all human societies and economies into two types of institutions: inclusive institutions and extractive institutions.
Let me make sure I have this straight, because it sounds like a core concept we need for the rest of the deep dive. Inclusive institutions are systems that distribute power broadly, right?
Correct.
They protect property rights, they encourage a free press, they allow everyone to participate in economic life, and they foster innovation because people know they can actually keep the fruits of their labor.
Precisely. They create a virtuous cycle of growth because the society benefits as a whole, but then you have the polar opposite, extractive institutions.
Extractive institutions, I mean, the name really does say it all, but break down exactly how they function in this context.
Extractive institutions are explicitly designed by a ruling elite to siphon resources, wealth, and labor from the vast majority of people to benefit a very small, powerful minority.
Okay.
Colonialism was the ultimate weaponized extractive institution. The goal of the colonizers in Africa or the Americas wasn't to build a level playing field. It wasn't to foster local African economies or set up inclusive democracies.
Right.
The goal was pure, unadulterated extraction. And to see how this works mechanically, we don't have to look in the abstract. Look at the dual economy in South Africa discussed in the sources.
Yes, the South African example is mind-blowing. Let's really linger on this because it perfectly illustrates Rodney's point about underdevelopment being an active verb. Walk us through the mechanics of that dual economy.
So in the early 20th century, European colonizers in South Africa passed a series of land acts. They systematically and legally forced roughly 80% of the native African population into tiny, resource-poor territories known as homelands or reserves.
Right.
Now, these homelands accounted for only about 13% of the total landmass of the country.
Let me jump in there because I want you, the listener, to really visualize this.
Yeah.
Imagine taking 80% of the population of your country and forcing them, by gunpoint and law, to live on the worst, least fertile 13% of the land.
It's staggering.
It's a mathematical impossibility for them to thrive. And they didn't do this just because they wanted separation. They did it as a highly calculated economic strategy.
Exactly.
By pushing millions of people onto land that was physically too small to sustain them agriculturally, the colonizers actively destroyed the independent African farming economy, which up until that point had actually been growing and competing with white farmers.
Yes.
They actively stamped out African economic progress.
Exactly. And here is the extractive genius of it. Why did they destroy African agriculture? Because the European-controlled gold and diamond mines had just been discovered, and they needed a massive reservoir of cheap, uneducated, desperate labor.
Right. If they can farm, they won't mine.
Exactly. If Africans could successfully farm their own land, they wouldn't go work in the dangerous, brutal mines for poverty wages. So the colonizers engineered a reality where the Africans had no choice.
No choice at all.
The poverty of the homelands was not an accident. It was a strict economic requirement for the wealth of the diamond mines.
It's like a rigged game of Monopoly. Imagine sitting down to play Monopoly, but before you even roll the dice, one player legally decrees that you can only ever land on Baltic and Mediterranean Avenue,
Right.
and they get all the other properties, the bank, and the get-out-of-jail-free cards. You aren't losing because you're bad at Monopoly. You're losing because the rules were constructed specifically to drain your starting capital into their bank account.
That is a perfect analogy. The institutions in South Africa were structured to extract that labor at the lowest possible cost, keeping the African workers perpetually poor, unable to build generational wealth, while generating immense world-changing capital for the colonizers.
Wow.
That is an extractive institution working at peak efficiency.
I really want our listener to sit with that for a second. Think about how we usually view poverty in our modern society. We so often frame it as a failure of the impoverished group.
Always a failure to adapt.
Right. A failure to work hard, a failure to get the right education, a failure to modernize. But what these texts, Rodney, Smaglu, Robinson, are telling us is that in the context of this global architecture, poverty was actively engineered. One society was held down legally, systematically, and violently, specifically to propel another society forward.
And that engineered poverty, that massive architecture of extraction, wasn't just happening on the continent of Africa. It was simultaneously being built, refined, and perfected across the Atlantic Ocean, laying the very economic foundation of the United States.
Which brings us to the domestic side of this deep dive. Let's look at Claude Anderson's Black Labor, White Wealth, and Manning Marable's How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America.
Two essential texts.
Absolutely essential. Both of these incredibly dense, powerful texts argue forcefully that black labor was the primary wealth-building foundation of the United States. Period. Not a side note in history, not an unfortunate chapter, but the engine itself.
It's an argument that demands a very close look at the timeline of exploitation in America. It's vital for us to view this not as a series of isolated, disjointed historical eras.
Right, like we tend to compartmentalize it.
Exactly. Like, okay, we had slavery and then that ended. Then we had Jim Crow and then that ended. Then we had the civil rights movement and now everything is fine.
Yeah, that's the standard textbook narrative.
But we have to view it as an unbroken, constantly evolving chain of economic extraction. Let's start with chattel slavery. As Marable points out, citing Karl Marx of all people, slavery wasn't just an act of immense human cruelty. It was an economic category of the highest importance to the global market. Marx wrote, "Without slavery, no cotton, without cotton, no modern industry."
Right, it was the absolute engine of global trade. The raw materials, the cotton, the tobacco, the sugar harvested by millions of unpaid black laborers in the American South fed the textile mills of England and the northern U.S.
It fueled the world.
It literally jump-started the Industrial Revolution. It created Wall Street, insurance markets, shipping empires. So when slavery was legally abolished after the Civil War, the economic imperative of the system, the desperate need for cheap, exploitable labor to keep profit margins high, didn't change.
Not at all.
Only the methods of extraction mutated. We moved into the era of quasi-freedom and Jim Crow. And the data from this period, particularly in the North where people assumed things were much better, is absolutely chilling.
It truly is chilling. When we look at the period right around 1850, examining free blacks in the North, people who were supposedly living entirely outside the institution of slavery, we see the architecture of extraction adapting perfectly.
Adapting perfectly.
Leonard P. Curry's historical research on urban America during this time is illuminating and, frankly, horrifying. He shows that in major, supposedly liberal cities like Boston, free blacks were forced by systemic exclusion to live in literal cellars and blind alleys.
Cellars?
Yes. Because of these engineered living conditions, the mortality rate for blacks in Boston was 99 times higher than it was for whites.
Wait, 99 times higher?
Yeah.
That is a staggering statistic. Let me just repeat that for you listening. 99 times higher mortality rate for free black people in Boston.
It's almost unbelievable.
And Curry's research shows that more than a third of the black population lived in these horrific subterranean conditions. By the eve of the Civil War, records show that over 50% of free blacks were classified as paupers, essentially utterly destitute.
Right.
Yet, as Claude Anderson notes in Black Labor, White Wealth, when these taxpayers sought public assistance to survive, they were routinely denied. Anderson highlights data from Cincinnati. Out of over 3,000 cases of public relief granted by the city, only 10 went to black residents. And those 10 were solely to cover burial expenses, so the bodies wouldn't pile up in the streets. Meanwhile, White European immigrants arriving with nothing were actively receiving public aid to help them settle, buy land, and build generational wealth.
This perfectly illustrates the illusion of freedom. You had a population of newly freed people who possessed absolutely nothing but their own physical labor power to sell.
Nothing else.
They had no land, no capital, no legal protections. The system, through sharecropping in the South and exclusionary labor union practices in the North, ensured that this labor was bought at artificially depressed wages.
Let me stop you there, because you mentioned sharecropping, but the sources also heavily discuss peonage and convict leasing for anyone who might confuse those terms with just standard, low-wage farming. What exactly made peonage and convict leasing so insidious?
It's a really great question. Sharecropping was bad enough. It was a system where you rented land and paid the owner with a share of the crop.
Right.
But the owner controlled the ledger, ensuring you were always in debt. But peonage was literal debt slavery.
Debt slavery.
Yes. It was a system where an employer forces a worker to pay off a debt with work, but the debt is mathematically structured so it can never be repaid. It was illegal, but widely practiced and ignored by law enforcement.
Wow.
And convict leasing was even more direct. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery except as a punishment for a crime.
Right, the loophole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Southern states immediately passed black codes laws, making it a crime for a black man to be unemployed or to speak loudly or to walk beside a railroad track.
Just fabricated charges.
Yes. They would arrest thousands of black men on these fabricated charges and then lease them as prisoner labor to private corporations. Coal mines, steel mills, plantations.
So they essentially recreated slavery through a constitutional loophole. The state became the slave master and rented the labor to private businesses.
Exactly. These were just new, legally sanctioned mechanisms to guarantee that white capitalist profit margins remain astronomical, while black laborers remain in a state of perpetual dependency and wealth extraction.
And we see the compounding interest of that extraction today. It didn't just vanish into the ether. Anderson provides some modern statistics that bring this historical extraction crashing right into the present moment.
It really does.
He notes that historically, the average white household has 10 times more wealth than the average black household in America.
10 times.
And the wealth gap at the very top is so incredibly vast that just the 3 richest white Americans hold more net worth than all black-owned businesses in the entire country combined.
It's hard to wrap your head around.
I really want that to sink in for you as you listen.
Yeah.
3 individuals hold more wealth than millions of black entrepreneurs combined. That doesn't happen by accident.
No.
That doesn't happen because one group just works slightly harder. That is the mathematical result of centuries of compound interest on extracted labor.
It's also crucial when we look at this architecture that we examine how this economic exploitation intersects with other societal hierarchies. Manning Marable makes a very specific, vital point about black women in his text. He refers to them as the slaves of slaves.
That is a heavy phrase. Break down what he means by that in an economic sense.
Marable points out that black women have historically faced the compounded, crushing weight of patriarchy, virulent racism, and capitalist exploitation all at exactly the same time.
Right.
Because of this intersection, they have historically experienced the highest rates of poverty and unemployment. When they were allowed into the workforce, they were often relegated to the most marginalized, lowest-paying domestic and service roles.
Cleaning houses, raising other people's children, washing clothes.
Yes. They were the shock absorbers for the entire system. They were, and in many structural ways still are, the most heavily exploited group within the capitalist structure because they face extraction based on race, class, and gender.
Which perfectly transitions us to the psychological justifications used for all of this.
Right.
Because you simply cannot build a system this brutal, this unequal, and this massive without a really, really good story to tell yourself about why it's okay.
You absolutely need a narrative.
Right. If you are extracting the lifeblood of millions of people, you need a narrative to sleep at night. Both Rodney and Marable take dead aim at the great American myth of individualism.
Yes, the myth of wrecked individualism. It is the bedrock of Western capitalist ideology.
Right. The myth claims that hard work equals wealth. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you put your nose to the grindstone, you innovate, and you get rich. We hear it on every motivational speech and LinkedIn post today.
All the time.
But let me play devil's advocate here, or rather, let me channel the skepticism of our authors. If the equation hard work equals wealth were actually historically true, The enslaved Africans who worked in the blazing sun from sunrise to sundown for centuries, completely unrewarded, building the infrastructure of the richest nation on Earth, would be the wealthiest people on the planet today.
Exactly.
The fact that they aren't completely shatters the illusion that hard work alone dictates prosperity.
It completely exposes the fallacy of that narrative when it is divorced from institutional power and property rights. And this brings us to a critical foundational consensus among these authors.
Okay.
Rodney, Clark, and Marable all agree on this specific point, and it challenges how most of us are taught history. They argue that white racism didn't just accidentally run parallel to capitalism.
Right.
It wasn't an unfortunate byproduct. Racism was an integral part of the capitalist mode of production itself.
Let me stop you there because I think a lot of people, myself included, often view racism as primarily an emotional prejudice, a fear of the unknown, and ignorance, a hatred of the other. You're saying these authors view it entirely differently.
That is the common psychological view, yes. But the economic historians look at the ledger. They argue that Europeans didn't sail to Africa, dismantle empires, and enslave millions of people primarily out of an innate biological racial hatred.
They did it for the money.
They did it for cold, hard economic reasons. They desperately needed mass labor to exploit the vast, newly stolen agricultural resources of the Americas. Right. Racism was manufactured, scientifically categorized, legally codified, and institutionalized as a rationalization to justify this brutal, unprecedented extraction.
Oppression follows exploitation to guarantee it.
Precisely. You have to convince yourself, your society, your church, and your legal system that the people you are brutally exploiting are somehow less than human, childlike, or biologically suited for heavy labor.
Otherwise, the guilt would destroy the society.
Exactly. If you don't institutionalize that racism, the cognitive dissonance of your civilized Christian society would tear it apart from the inside. Racism was the psychological lubricant for the engine of capitalist extraction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When you start to look at racism not just as an individual's bad feeling, but as a systemic economic utility, you start to see how it operates in the background of everyday life.
It's everywhere.
Michelle Alexander captures this perfectly in The New Jim Crow when she introduces the philosopher Marilyn Frye's metaphor of the birdcage. I absolutely love this analogy because it makes the invisible visible.
It is one of the most effective ways to explain systemic inequality to someone who might not see it.
Let's walk you through it. Imagine you walk up to a birdcage and you put your face right up against the bars and your field of vision focuses tightly on just one single wire of the cage.
Just one wire.
You look at that one wire and you look at the bird and you might wonder, why doesn't the bird just fly around it? It's just one wire. Fly to the left or fly over it. That one wire in our society might represent a discriminatory housing policy like redlining, or it might represent an underfunded local public school.
Right, and if you only focus on that one single wire, you naturally blame the bird for not escaping. You say, just fly away, move to a different neighborhood, get a scholarship. You attribute the bird's captivity to its own lack of effort.
But then you step back. You take a wide-angle view of the entire cage. You see that it's not just one wire, it's the wire of historical redlining, plus the wire of unequal property taxes funding schools, plus the wire of employment discrimination, plus the wire of the historical wealth gap where you have no inheritance to fall back on, plus the wire of a healthcare system that ignores your pain.
It all connects.
When you step back, you realize it is a perfectly constructed interlocking cage. If you dodge one wire, you hit another. The bird isn't failing to fly. It is actively trapped by a system designed to keep it exactly where it is.
And if we look at the modern era, the most prominent, heavily reinforced steel wire of that cage is the American criminal justice system. This is where Michelle Alexander's work in The New Jim Crow is absolutely vital.
It's a profound book.
She argues powerfully that mass incarceration operates as a newly redesigned racial caste system. She calls it the undercaste.
But I want to make sure I'm understanding this, because how is mass incarceration different from the Jim Crow systems we just talked about? Slavery and Jim Crow were explicitly about extracting labor for profit. Is mass incarceration just modern slavery?
That's a crucial distinction she makes. Chattel slavery and Jim Crow were designed primarily to exploit and extract black labor for the agrarian and early industrial economy. Alexander suggests that mass incarceration in our current post-industrial, heavily automated society functions differently.
Okay, how so?
While prison labor certainly exists and corporations do profit from it, the primary macroeconomic goal isn't labor extraction. Instead, It's about warehousing.
Warehousing.
Yes, it's about warehousing a massive population that the modern capitalist economy has deemed irrelevant or surplus. When the factories closed in the Rust Belt and inner cities, the state didn't provide massive job retraining or social safety nets. They built prisons.
It's a terrifying concept. You don't need their labor anymore, so you just lock them away to manage the surplus.
Yeah.
And the wild thing is, Manning Marable predicted this exact scenario back in the early 1980s.
He saw it coming.
Long before mass incarceration was a mainstream talking point, long before the documentaries and the bipartisan reform bills, Marable was warning about the rise of what he called a carceral state.
Yep.
He foresaw that as industrial jobs left the inner cities for cheaper labor overseas, the state would manage the resulting unemployment and poverty, not with welfare or education, but with cages. He literally called them factories with fences.
Factories with fences. That phrase is haunting.
He predicted decades ago that prisons would become one of the fastest growing, most profitable industries in America, feeding off black bodies in a completely new way.
His foresight was tragically mathematically accurate. The data Alexander and others present paints a grim, undeniable picture. Black men are imprisoned at a rate 6.4 times higher than white men.
6.4 times.
At the time these texts were compiling your research, 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 34 was incarcerated.
1 in 9.
1 in 9. That is a missing generation. And Alexander points out something conceptually vital here. She argues the criminal justice system acts as a race-making institution.
Okay, stop right there. A race-making institution. That sounds very academic. How does a building or a legal system actively invent or make race?
It means the system serves to define what race actually means in America today, in practical terms. Think about it this way. Explicit, overt racial discrimination hanging a whites-only sign on a door is now illegal and widely condemned by society.
Right, you can't do this anymore.
So the system of hierarchy needs a new proxy, needs a new language. By heavily policing black neighborhoods, by waging a war on drugs almost exclusively in communities of color, while ignoring identical drug use rates in white suburbs.
Identical rates.
And by marking millions of black youth as criminals or felons, the system can legally strip them of their rights.
The label felon becomes the new black.
Precisely. Once you are labeled a felon, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against you. You can be denied housing, you can be denied employment, you can be denied student loans, and in many states, you lose the right to vote.
Wow.
The genius of the system is that it functions completely colorblindly on the surface. Judges and politicians can honestly say, we aren't punishing race, we are just punishing crime.
But underneath, it efficiently maintains a racial hierarchy and a permanent undercast, because the machinery of who gets stopped, who gets searched, who gets a plea deal, and who gets maximum sentencing is deeply racialized.
Exactly.
Which allows middle-class society to look the other way. They see the cage, but they say, well, the bird broke the law, completely ignoring that we only put police in the bird's neighborhood to catch them breaking it.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most important sociological question of the last century. How do deeply entrenched economic and power systems adapt when their overt methods become socially unacceptable or outright illegal?
They mutate.
Exactly. They mutate. They find new colorblind language, new bureaucratic structures to achieve the exact same extractive and marginalizing results. The architecture remains, only the wallpaper changes.
That mutation of power, that changing of the wallpaper, is a perfect pivot back to the global stage, specifically the African continent in the post-colonial era. Because when the European colonizers officially packed up their flags and went home in the 1950s and 60s, the extraction didn't necessarily stop.
No, it didn't.
The weights weren't magically removed from the ankles?
No, they absolutely were not. And Acemoglu and Robinson's Why Nations Fail is incredibly helpful for understanding why. They describe a political economic phenomenon they call the iron law of oligarchy.
Let's unpack that term, the iron law of oligarchy. What does that actually look like in practice?
When post-colonial independence movements successfully fought and overthrew European rulers in places like Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, or the Congo, there was immense hope.
Naturally.
But the tragedy of the post-colonial era was that many of the new local African leaders didn't dismantle the extractive institutions the Europeans had built. They didn't dismantle the monopolies, the forced labor structures, or the resource funnels.
What?
Because those institutions were incredibly ruthlessly efficient at funneling massive wealth and absolute power to the top. So instead of creating inclusive democracies that shared the wealth with the citizens, the new leaders just took over the existing extractive machinery to siphon wealth for themselves and their cronies.
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Mhm.
The driver changed, but the extractive engine remained identical.
Yeah.
But the West didn't just leave Africa alone after colonization to figure it out. They introduced a massive new mechanism that dominates global politics today: foreign aid.
Yes, foreign aid.
And this brings us to the most controversial book in our stack today, Dambisa Moyo's explosive critique, Dead Aid. Now, I want to be very clear with you as you listen to this next segment. The economic philosophies we are about to discuss represent wildly different, deeply politically charged viewpoints.
Very polarized.
Right. We are not taking a side or endorsing one over the other. We are laying out the arguments exactly as they exist in the source material so you can weigh these competing ideas yourself.
And Moyo's argument is deliberately, unapologetically provocative. She is an African economist, and she states that over $1 trillion in development assistance, charity, government grants, World Bank loans has been pumped into Africa over the last several decades.
$1 trillion.
And her verdict, it has made the continent vastly worse off.
Worse off.
Yes. She cites a stunning statistic that should stop anyone in their tracks. Over the last 30 years, the most aid-dependent countries in Africa have exhibited an average annual growth rate of minus 0.2%.
Wait, let me stop you, because that is completely counterintuitive to anyone who has ever donated to a global relief fund or watched a charity telethon. Negative growth.
Negative.
Despite $1 trillion in aid. How is it mechanically possible that giving a country free money makes them poorer?
Moyo argues that systematic government-to-government aid acts essentially like a resource curse. It destroys the social contract between a government and its people.
How does it do that?
Think about how a normal, functioning democracy works. A government needs money to build roads and schools, so it collects taxes from its citizens. Because the citizens are paying taxes, they demand accountability. We gave you our money, fix the potholes.
Right.
But if an African government gets all its budget from foreign donors and Western charities, it doesn't need to collect local taxes. And if it doesn't collect taxes, it doesn't have to listen to its citizens. It is accountable only to the foreign donors.
It severs the feedback loop of democracy.
Exactly. It engenders sheer laziness in policymakers. It funds massive, unwieldy public sectors that act as patronage networks, where politicians just give jobs to their supporters, and most destructively, it fuels rampant corruption, because there is a constant fire hose of free money with very little local oversight.
That makes a dark kind of sense.
Furthermore, Moyo argues the mechanism of aid actively stifles local entrepreneurship.
Give us an example of that.
Imagine you are an African entrepreneur who makes mosquito nets, and you employ 10 people in your village. Suddenly, a massive Western charity drops 10,000 free mosquito nets into your region. Your business goes bankrupt overnight. You have to fire your workers.
Oh, man.
When the charity leaves a year later, the nets tear, and now there is no local business left to replace them. You have created total dependency. You've destroyed the local private sector with good intentions.
So Moyo's critique is devastating. What is her proposed solution? Because she isn't just complaining, she offers a blueprint.
She proposes a radical shock therapy solution. Shut off the tap completely.
Complete shut it off.
Yes. Give African nations a 5-year warning to get their budgets in order and then permanently stop all systemic foreign aid.
5 years, then cold turkey. That is a massive shock to the system. It sounds incredibly harsh.
She acknowledges it would be incredibly painful in the short term, but her belief is that this shock therapy is the only way to force African nations to embrace the free market. They would have to rely on foreign direct investment, international trade, and the global bond markets.
Like the Asian tigers did.
Exactly. Like China, South Korea. They didn't rely on Western charity to pull millions out of poverty. They relied on manufacturing, trade, and integrating into the global capitalist economy. Moyo essentially argues for a pure, unapologetic capitalist integration.
And here, right here, is where we hit the grand collision of our sources. This is where the deep dive gets absolutely fascinating. Because Moyo is arguing that the solution to African underdevelopment is to fully embrace free market capitalism, cut the aid, and integrate into the global market.
Right.
But authors like Manning Marable and Walter Rodney, looking at the exact same history, argue that the global capitalist system itself is the root disease that caused the underdevelopment in the first place.
It is a stark foundational contrast in economic philosophy. You have brilliant, rigorous minds looking at the exact same history of extraction, the exact same timeline from 1482 to today, and coming to diametrically opposed conclusions about how to escape the birdcage.
So what does this all mean? We have outlined centuries of extraction, the mutation of racism, the failures of post-colonialism, and the massive wealth gap. Let's lay out the competing visions for the future, because each author gives us a different blueprint for how to actually dismantle the architecture of extraction.
Let's explore the solutions. We can start with Acemoglu and Robinson.
Okay.
Their view is deeply institutional. They argue that the only way forward for any nation is through political revolutions that force the creation of inclusive institutions. They don't believe you can tweak the economy without fixing the politics first.
You have to fix the foundation.
Right. You need broad coalitions of citizens demanding property rights, a level playing field, and the aggressive dismantling of monopolies. They believe in reforming the political structure to ensure economic opportunity for the many, creating a virtuous circle of innovation and growth.
Then you have Claude Anderson. His focus in black labor, white wealth, is entirely on black America, and his solution is what he calls group economics. Anderson argues that the historical pursuit of integration actually hurt black Americans economically.
Which is a very controversial take.
It is, but his logic is based on capital retention. He argues integration diluted black numerical strength and destroyed self-sustaining black business districts. Before integration, money circulated within the black community because they were forced to buy from each other.
Right.
After integration, that money immediately flowed out to white-owned corporations. So his blueprint calls for a national public policy specifically for black Americans and a laser focus on building vertical businesses.
Explain vertical integration in his context.
Take the music or sports industries. Black talent absolutely dominates these spaces globally. But Anderson argues that being the talent isn't enough. The wealth is in the ownership.
The ownership.
Right. Black entrepreneurs shouldn't just be the artists or the athletes. They need to own the record labels, the distribution networks, the streaming platforms, the sports teams, the arenas, and the merchandise factories. Total vertical control from top to bottom to keep the wealth circulating within the community before it ever leaves.
It's a powerful model.
Yeah.
And then there's Manning Marable, who takes a much more radical systemic view. Marable argues for a complete, unequivocal break from capitalism. He advocates for what he calls socialism from below.
Socialism from below.
Yes. His core conviction is that because global capitalism was literally built on the extraction of black labor and the maintenance of a racial hierarchy, black people as a group will never achieve true liberation within that system.
You can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house.
In his view, you cannot cure the patient with the poison that made them sick. He calls for a democratic, multicultural, socialist restructuring of the entire economy where wealth and production are collectively owned.
And finally, circling back to Dambisa Moyo, her blueprint is perhaps the most heavily debated in mainstream development economics. She argues that to push through the harsh but necessary free market reforms, like cutting bloated public sectors, ending subsidies, and inviting in massive foreign investment, African nations might actually need what she controversially terms decisive, benevolent dictatorships in the short term.
Yes, she points to models like Singapore or early South Korea, where authoritarian leaders force through painful economic modernization without having to worry about losing the next election.
Wow.
She suggests that once a robust, educated middle class is established through trade and investment, then democratic accountability will naturally follow because the middle class will demand it. It's a wealth-first, democracy-later approach.
It's an incredibly wide spectrum of solutions. You have authors arguing for reforming political institutions, authors arguing for racial solidarity and vertical monopolies within capitalism, authors arguing for dismantling capitalism entirely, and authors arguing for enforcing pure capitalism through short-term authoritarianism.
But what unifies all of these sources, despite their vastly different prescriptions for the future, is the undeniable historical reality of the diagnosis. The current disparities in wealth, power, and development that we see today are not accidents of nature.
No.
They are not the result of one group working harder than another. They are the deliberate, mathematically predictable results of historical and ongoing systems of extraction.
Exactly, and that is exactly why we brought you on this deep dive today. We want you, the listener, to realize that these texts, whether you ultimately agree with their political solutions or not, are not just dusty history books meant for graduate seminars.
They are completely relevant today.
They are the living blueprints of your modern neighborhood. They explain the zoning laws in your city, they explain the funding of your local school, they explain the racial wealth gap in your country, and they explain the invisible forces shaping the global economy you interact with every single day when you buy a cup of coffee sourced from Africa, or a new smartphone built with cobalt from the Congo. By understanding the true architecture of extraction, by seeing all the wires of the birdcage, we can actually start to figure out how to build something better.
That's the ultimate goal.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense, challenging, and transformative journey.
It has been an absolute pleasure to unpack this with you. And as we leave you today, I want to offer one final lingering question for you to turn over in your mind on your commute or wherever you are right now.
I love these. Let's hear it.
It's a concept that hums beneath all of these texts, but wasn't explicitly debated today. If our entire global economic system relies on the metric of gross domestic product, or GDP, to measure the absolute success and health of a nation, what does it mean that GDP completely ignores the human cost, the historical theft, and the environmental extraction required to produce those numbers?
Oh, wow.
If a private prison cages a human being and generates profit for shareholders, it adds to the GDP. If a community's labor is brutally exploited to produce cheap, fast fashion goods, it adds to the GDP. If a forest is clear-cut, it adds to the GDP. Are we actually measuring the health and prosperity of our societies, or are we merely measuring the ruthless efficiency of our extraction?
Wow. That is the exact kind of question that changes how you see the world. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep asking the hard questions, keep reading, keep challenging the narratives you were handed, and keep looking past the surface of the headlines. We'll catch you on the next Deep Dive.